In this lesson, we'll talk about the process of selecting and moving objects inside of Softimage. Okay, so to begin this lesson, we're actually going to open up a very simple scene file for us to work with. So let's go to File, Open, and because this is Lesson 7, you should see a scene file in here called 07 Begin. And by the time you actually work along with this, you should see a scene file for basically every single lesson in here. So from this point forward, you're going to get used to the process of loading up a scene. And again, you can find this inside of the Introduction to Softimage Scenes folder, which you should have as part of your downloadable scene files for this course. So let's open up 07 Begin, and let's get to work. So like I said, we're going to talk about the process of working, selecting and moving objects inside of Softimage. So the process of just simply selecting an object at first glance might seem very simple. Just simply click to select it. But as we'll see here in just a moment, this is a little bit misleading because the process of selecting objects can be a little bit tricky at first. So let's talk about the process of moving objects first, and this will kind of lead us into the discussion about selecting objects. So when it comes to moving objects, we can do this through the Transform menu over here on the far right-hand side of your interface. So we have Scale, Rotate, and Translate. Now, if we wanted to, let's say, move this object around in space, we could just simply click on this T button for the Translate, and you can see that pulls open these little transformation manipulators. So I can simply grab that, and just simply grab one of these handles to move it, this sphere, in any one axis. Now, I could go ahead and grab this manipulator right here in the middle and move it freely along all three axes at the same time. Now, we could also move this along any two axes if I chose. So if you look very carefully, you can see this little yellow box that appears right in the center of my manipulator as I start to move this around. Now I can actually position my mouse between any two manipulators, and you can see this little yellow box sort of starts to lay flat along two of those axes. What that's doing is indicating which of these two axes I can start to pull across. So let's say I wanted to shuffle this object around the Z and the X axis, but not move it up or down on the Y axis. Like I said, I just put my manipulator or my cursor right between these two axis manipulators so that this little yellow box kind of lays flat. And now you can see the X handle and the Z handle highlight yellow, but that green Y axis still stays green, which means it's not being affected. So now I can slide this object freely along the X and the Z axis and not move it at all up or down. Okay, very nice. Now, if I wanted to get this object right back to where it was, I could come in here and just simply zero out the transformations. So right now I've moved it -1 degree in the x-axis, moved it upward a little bit in the y-axis, and have moved it just a little bit in the z-axis as well. So what I could do is come in and just simply zero those out, and now this object is right back at its original position. Okay, now let's say I wanted to rotate this object. Well, we could just simply click on this little rotate button, this little R, and now that brings open my rotation arcs. So now I can grab these little rings here and rotate this object around any three axes that I wanted to. And once again, if I wanted to reset those, I could just zero out those rotations, and then we're right back to where we were. And then finally we have the scale, which is pretty much just resizing our objects. So just like we had before with our translation tool, we can come in and scale this object along any one axis. If I undo by by just pressing Control Z on my keyboard, I can get that right back to where it was. I can also scale along any two axes, just like with my translate tool, or I could scale along all three axes by placing my manipulator right in the middle of all three of those handles, and you can see I'm scaling equally or uniformly in all three axes. Okay, very nice. Now, when it comes to moving back and forth between these different scale, rotate, and translate tools, it can get a little bit tedious to jump back and forth between this by actually moving my mouse over here and clicking on this little button. So there's actually keyboard shortcuts that move you back and forth between these, and I really prefer to use the keyboard shortcut. So the translate tool is going to be the V key on your keyboard. So if I tap the V key, you can see that takes me to my translate tool. The rotate keyboard shortcut is C. So there's the C key, just quickly tapping that. And then the scale tool is going to be my X key. So once again, X for scale, C for rotate, and V for translate. So you're going to find me from this point forward pretty much using those keyboard shortcuts exclusively. I almost never make it a habit of going over here and manually entering my transform mode. The keyboard shortcuts are going to be a much faster way of going about this. Okay, now let's talk about the process of actually selecting an object once again. So this is where things start to get a little bit tricky. So I have my sphere here selected, and you can see right now if I tap the T key on my keyboard, or rather the V key on my keyboard, that'll take me to my translate tool. Now watch what happens if I try to come over here and grab this little red cone. You can see even though I try to grab it, it still acts as though I'm trying to move this object. Okay, so here's another keyboard shortcut that we have to remember, and that is the space bar. The space bar is pretty much the keyboard shortcut for your select tool. So if I tap my space bar, you can see that my manipulator goes away, and now I can freely come in here and grab another object. And then once again, tap the V key on my keyboard, and now we're back to my translate tool. Okay, so this brings us into sort of another topic, or leads us into another topic, which is the subject of sticky keys. Now, in Softimage, any keyboard shortcut can have one of two functions. You can either tap that keyboard shortcut to stay in that tool, or you can press and hold the keyboard shortcut to only temporarily access that tool. So here's a perfect example. You can see right now if I wanted to go back and select this sphere, I would have to tap my spacebar, select it, and then tap my V key once again to get back to my translate tool. Now, a much easier way to do this would be to press and hold your keyboard shortcuts. So you can see right now I have my translate tool active. Now I'm going to press and hold my spacebar, make my selection, and now as soon as I let off my spacebar, it takes me right back to the tool I had active before. So anytime you press and hold a keyboard shortcut like the spacebar, it will temporarily access that command until you let off of that keyboard shortcut, and then it takes you right back to whatever tool you had active before. And in my case, that is the translate tool. But you can see this really holds true to anything. So if I were to, let's say, switch to my rotate tool temporarily, I can press and hold the C key on my keyboard, make my rotation, and then as soon as I let off the C key, it takes me right back to the tool I had active before, in my case, the translate tool. So definitely a little thing that takes a little bit of getting used to inside of Softimage, this notion that keyboard shortcuts can work in two different ways depending on if you quickly tap that keyboard shortcut or if you press and hold that keyboard shortcut, and you can get two very different functions from that. Now, if you don't necessarily like the idea of having to come in and switch to your selection tool to actually make a selection from this little green sphere to something like this cone, that is actually something that we can change and make alterations to. And we can change that in some of the settings that we'll get into and talk about in our next lesson. But for now, that's just a quick look at the process of selecting objects, moving around and repositioning objects, as well as the notion of getting used to the sticky keys or the sticky keyboard shortcuts inside of Softimage. So in the next lesson, we'll take a look at some more advanced features that relate to the same topic.